The boy who once refused to speak, who couldn't get out of bed, who thought the world had forgotten how to feel, was the only person a dying wildcat trusted with her children. He didn't cry when they left, not even when the last paw print melted into the thawing soil. He just stood there, still, quiet, watching the woods they disappeared into. The same woods their mother limped back into all those months ago. She had come to our door broken, barely breathing, and left behind everything that mattered to her. And now, the cubs she trusted us with, trusted him with, were walking away too. Not because they stopped needing him, but because he helped them remember who they were. And in doing that, they reminded him who he was too. This isn't just a story about rescue. It's a story about being chosen and learning how to let go. This is a tale of how a broken wild mother gave her last hope to a boy who'd nearly given up himself. If stories like this remind you that healing can come from the most unexpected places, subscribe for more true stories of quiet miracles, wild bonds, and second chances. I first heard her before I saw her, before I understood what her presence would mean, not just for the two small lives clinging to her side, but for my son, who hadn't smiled in months. It was just after 6 on a Sunday morning. A weak frost clung to the pine needles, like the forest was holding its breath. I was standing by the kitchen sink, rinsing the last of last night's dishes, when I heard a faint scrape against the porch, followed by a low thud, like something had settled its weight down slowly. We live on the edge of nothing, just trees and wind and the occasional deer track in the snow. Caleb and I had moved here the previous fall after the silence between us had grown too wide for city walls to contain. I thought the stillness of the Adirondacks would heal him, or maybe I just needed to believe it would. His therapists had called it situational depression. I didn't know what to call it. Some days, it looked like sleep. Other days, like stillness so profound it hurt to watch. I wiped my hands dry and stepped toward the window. The trees stood motionless, stiff against the grey morning light. Everything was quiet. Except, there it was again. A dragging sound, deliberate, tired. I opened the door. She was there, slumped across the far side of the porch, half in shadow. A lynx, not a large one, but even injured, she had a presence that stopped time. Her coat was mottled silver and brown, with black tufts on her ears like paintbrush tips. Her eyes, dim, golden, haunting, met mine. I didn't move, neither did she. The only movement was her breathing, shallow and uneven. One leg was twisted unnaturally beneath her, caked in dried blood and dirt. Her ribs rose too sharply, like she hadn't eaten in days. There was no panic in her gaze, no aggression, just resignation. A breath behind me made me turn. Caleb stood in the doorway, hoodie up, eyes still glassy from sleep. He hadn't said a word to me the day before, or the one before that. I didn't expect him to speak now, but his gaze locked on hers, and something happened. Not a flicker, not a change in expression, but a softening of the air around him. I could feel it, like the silence he'd been wrapped in had shifted shape. I stepped aside, but he didn't move forward, just watched. That's when we heard it, the faintest chirrup from the trees. Then another, like small, frightened voices calling into the cold. 2 tiny shapes emerged from the brush, barely bigger than kittens, their spots still visible under the fluff of youth. The lynx cubs wobbled as they came forward, their heads turning in quick, nervous movements. The mother didn't rise. She only lifted her head a few inches, just enough for them to see her. One stumbled over a pine root, the other let out a shrill cry. They hesitated, then padded towards her, curling against her flank as though the cold might finally be held at bay. I felt Caleb's hand brush mine. "She's not gonna make it," he whispered. It was the first thing he'd said out loud in nearly a month. I turned to him, startled. His voice broke the morning wide open. That evening, we brought out a bowl of water and a handful of chicken scraps. The mother didn't move much. Caleb sat just inside the threshold, knees tucked to his chest, not blinking. I watched him watching her. "She brought them here," he said softly. "Not by accident." "How do you know?" "I'd do the same, if I knew I couldn't take care of something." There was no self-pity in his voice, just a tired wisdom that felt older than 14. I wanted to ask him what it was like, to feel that low, but I didn't. Instead, I fetched an old wool blanket and tucked it around his legs. We sat together for hours, the porch light casting a soft amber glow over the mother and her cubs. She didn't touch the food, didn't move when night came, didn't react when owls began calling from the woods. Just breathed, shallow, slow, as though time itself were measured by her pulse. And in the morning, she was gone. No blood, no noise. Just the faintest drag of paw prints leading back into the woods. And two cubs, curled together like she had folded her final hope into their bodies. They mewled into the emptiness that first morning. Tiny cries, high and searching, punctuated by frantic glances at the tree line, as if the trees might give her back. But the forest gave nothing. I stood at the porch with a thermal mug of tea in my hands, still half dreaming, trying to believe what I was seeing. The two cubs, fuzzy, wild, impossibly vulnerable, paced the porch boards, sniffing at the corners where she'd lain. Caleb emerged slowly, arms crossed tight against the chill. He crouched near them, saying nothing. They hissed at first, backing away into the crate we'd put out the night before. But they didn't flee. He stayed like that for hours, just sitting. By noon, he'd named them. "Noko," he said, pointing to the bolder one, "and Ash." That day, he dug through the shed and found an old pet crate from years ago. He lined it with fleece and filled two shallow bowls with mashed kibble and water. The cubs resisted at first, scrambling, frightened, wild. But Caleb never forced, just waited. They began to eat by nightfall, and something in Caleb began to eat again too. The days passed in a kind of quiet rhythm. Caleb's alarm began going off at sunrise. Not that he needed it. He was often awake before the sun. I'd hear his footsteps in the hallway, the creak of the porch door, the soft scuffle of him kneeling to check the cubs. He began keeping a journal, sketching their movements in pencil. How Noko climbed and Ash crouched. How their ears flicked in opposite directions when they listened. I watched him out the window one morning as he lay belly down on the floorboards, face to face with Noko. He smiled. It was so small I almost didn't believe it, but it was real. One afternoon, I made hot cocoa and carried 2 mugs out onto the porch. He didn't look up as I approached. Noko was curled in his lap. Ash lay beside him on a folded sweatshirt. "She's the quiet one," he said. "Like you," I replied. He didn't answer at first. Then, I think, maybe she's still waiting for her mum. "Aren't you?" He looked at me for a long time. "She didn't leave because she didn't love them," he whispered. "She left because she did." I nodded. That's what makes it love. That night, a car pulled up the long gravel road. I opened the door to find a short woman in a dark green parka and a wildlife badge clipped to her chest. Her name was Erin. Someone had reported a lynx sighting with unusual behavior. "I'm not here to take them," she said quickly, sensing my fear. "I just need to see." Caleb sat on the porch, silent as always, while Erin knelt beside the enclosure and watched. She asked questions, took notes, gently tested their reflexes, watched how they responded to Caleb's voice. "They're too young to be alone in the wild," she said, standing, "and they've clearly bonded." Caleb looked up, eyes wary. "You've done something rare," she said softly. "Something good. Just remember they won't stay cubs forever." He nodded. "I know," he said. "I'm not keeping them. I'm helping them leave." It's strange how quickly the wild can begin to feel like family. Within a few weeks, the porch transformed. It no longer felt like the space between home and woods. It became something softer. Like a threshold, the world had drawn between wildness and healing, where both were allowed to sit quietly and learn from one another. Caleb reinforced the makeshift enclosure with branches and wood panels from the shed. We padded the inside with towels, fleece, and an overturned milk crate for shelter. He strung a faded scarf across the back like a curtain, so Ash could have a place to hide when she needed silence. She often did. Noko, on the other hand, was growing bold, testing boundaries, leaping at moths, tackling Caleb's bootlaces. The boy who once couldn't face his own reflection was now teaching wild animals how to play, chicken wire when he left, and squeaking eagerly when he returned. They knew his scent, his shape, his silence. Sometimes he sat with them long into the night, the only light coming from the lantern we hung above the porch. I'd watch from the kitchen window, tea cooling in my hands, as he whispered into their fur, nose pressed to Noko's ear. "They make the silence feel different," he told me once. "It doesn't feel empty anymore." Winter deepened slowly. Snow began to cling to the trees in heavy, wet clusters. Our world turned white, and time became quieter. The cubs grew stronger. Their fur thickened, their movements faster, more precise. They began to climb, to wrestle, to vanish into the trees for a few minutes at a time, always returning. One morning, Caleb opened the crate and sat down on the porch step without a sound. Ash followed him, curling beside his hip. Noko leapt up onto the porch rail and stared into the distance. "They're not pets," Caleb said that morning. "They're visitors." I nodded, unsure what to say. There was a maturity in his voice now, something I hadn't heard before. "I know they'll leave," he continued. "But until they do, I think they need to remember what it feels like to be safe." I wanted to say, "You needed that too," but I didn't, because he already knew. Then came the day Erin returned. She brought gloves and a notepad, her expression unreadable. She checked the cubs, now nearly 4 months old, handling them with practiced gentleness. Ash squirmed, mewing low. Noko hissed and bolted, climbing up Caleb's back and perching on his shoulder like a wary sentinel. "They're healthy," she said. "Too healthy to stay contained." She knelt beside Caleb. "You've done something incredible here," she said gently. "But the law doesn't always know how to make room for incredible things." Caleb stared at her, face unreadable. "I'm not asking you to give them up. I'm asking you to start letting them remember who they are." He didn't speak, but he nodded. From that day on, the door of the enclosure stayed open. At first, they didn't seem to notice. They continued their daily games, bounding through the snow, curling into Caleb's lap. But then Noko began to venture farther. He chased squirrels up the trees, disappeared into the pines for longer stretches. He came back each time, licking snow off his paws, eyes bright. Ash was slower to follow. She remained tethered to the porch like an echo. Caleb was patient. He didn't coax, he didn't beg. He simply sat, weathered, steady, until she was ready. One afternoon, as sunlight sliced through the trees in golden beams, both cubs disappeared into the forest together and didn't return until the next morning. That evening, Caleb stood by the kitchen window, watching the woods like he was listening to them breathe. "I think I'm okay if they don't come back one day," he said. "Really?" He nodded, "Because they'll still be out there somewhere." Then, after a pause, "And I'll still be me." March came with a cold clarity, no longer the silence of winter, but the waiting of something about to break open. The snow had begun to retreat from the porch. The forest was raw and skeletal. The air carried the scent of old leaves and thawed soil. And the cubs, once clumsy bundles of fur, had become something else entirely. Noko was nearly impossible to follow now, muscular, swift, graceful. His coat had darkened to a handsome blur of slate and silver. Ash still bore the softness of girlhood in her face, but she too had grown sleek and agile. They began to return less often, sometimes just once a day, then once every 2, then not at all. Caleb didn't chase them. He started writing more, long passages in his notebook, sketches of trees, maps of the paths they might be traveling. "They still come at night sometimes," he said one morning, pointing to faint paw prints in the melting frost. "I think they don't want me to know." He said it with a strange kind of pride. Then came the day only Ash returned. She was smaller than I remembered, her ribs a little sharper, her steps slower. She stood on the porch for a long time before moving. Caleb crouched and held out his arms. She hesitated, then melted into him, like she'd been holding her breath the entire time. She didn't eat, didn't play. "She's waiting for him," Caleb whispered. Noko didn't come back that night, or the next. For the first time in weeks, Caleb looked lost again. He wandered the woods for hours, scarf around his neck, Noko's favorite blanket in hand. I saw him pause at the edge of a frozen stream and just stare into the water, the blanket clutched in his fist. He didn't cry, he didn't shout, he just waited. And then, one soft afternoon, as snow began to fall again in thick, lazy spirals, we heard it. The familiar scrape on the porch boards. Not the soft uncertainty of before, but something purposeful. Noko. He was thin. He had a scrape along one shoulder and pine sap clinging to his fur. But he walked with a quiet pride, head high, eyes alert. He didn't rush into Caleb's arms. He stood still and waited. Ash leapt to him instantly, nuzzling, crying, circling him like she couldn't believe he was real. They curled together on the porch, pressing their faces into each other's fur like a promise had been kept. Caleb sat beside them, one hand on each of their backs. His eyes shone, but not with tears, with something steadier, something whole. "They came back," I said softly, standing at the door. "They came home," he corrected me. But we both knew the truth. It wouldn't be home for long. The wild had started calling them back. And this time, it wasn't asking for permission. By mid-April, the trees began to breathe again. The air, once thin and sharp, now carried the smell of wet bark and thawed earth. Shoots of green emerged from under the old snow. A pair of robins nested under the eaves of the porch. Everything in the forest seemed to be waking up, and so were they. Noko and Ash returned less and less. At first, it was every other day. Then it became every third. Caleb kept a quiet log. Each visit tallied like a leaf pinned in a book, small notations in the margins. Ash limping again. Noko alert, healthy, stayed 20 minutes. And then, nothing. No paw prints, no chirps, no scratching at the porch. 3 days passed, then a week. I expected Caleb to go looking again, to put on his coat and vanish into the trees like he had before. But he didn't. He stayed inside. He sat at the table and wrote in silence. He turned on the radio. He even picked up the sketchbook he hadn't touched since December. "They're not lost," he said, without looking up. "They're just remembering how to be wild." One morning, he stepped outside barefoot despite the frost and walked to the center of the clearing. He stood there with his eyes closed for nearly 10 minutes. I watched from the window, uncertain. Then he raised a hand, not waving, just holding it out like a quiet farewell. "They're close," he said when he came back in. "I don't need to see them to know." Weeks passed. Life began to press forward. Caleb's face no longer looked hollow. He started taking online classes again, wildlife biology, animal psychology. He even joined a quiet Zoom group for kids dealing with depression. I listened once, just outside his door. He said something I'll never forget. "I didn't save them. They saved me. I just gave them a place to rest until they remembered who they were." Late one May morning, the last moment arrived. It wasn't dramatic. There was no final visit, no long goodbye, just a soft rustling at the tree line. Two figures, sleek, silent, and strong, stood side by side beneath the boughs. Ash was taller now, Noko broader. They looked toward the house, not long, just long enough. Then they turned, and without a sound, vanished into the green. Caleb didn't cry. He stood there, arms crossed gently, a small, knowing smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "They're where they're meant to be," he whispered, "and so am I." We never saw them again, not clearly. Occasionally, paw prints appeared near the stream, or a flicker of silver would pass between the trees. Once, in July, I found a blue feather tucked into the old crate. Caleb said nothing, but I caught him tracing its edge with his fingers. Lips parted like a prayer. We kept the enclosure, now overgrown with wildflowers and moss. In early fall, a fox took shelter in it for a few nights. Birds nested in the corners. Life continued, quietly filling the space where the cubs had been. And in the house, on our kitchen wall, we hung two of Caleb's drawings. One of Noko, perched on the porch rail like a sentinel. One of Ash, curled in his hoodie, sleeping. Underneath them, he'd written in pencil, "She gave them to me." And they gave me back to myself. Some stories don't end with fanfare. They end like a breeze, like the soft hush of paw steps returning to the woods. The lynx who could barely walk gave her children to the world with the last of her strength. And a boy, who once could barely speak, met them with the last of his. In that space, between surrender and trust, something wild bloomed. Something worth remembering. If stories like this remind you that healing can come from the most unexpected places, subscribe for more true stories of quiet miracles, wild bonds, and second chances.